Good afternoon and welcome to you all. My name is Mark Hibbs. I'll be moderating this discussion. We have an hour and a quarter. We're going to be talking about Iran this afternoon, and I'm going to introduce the panelists. Each of the panelists will provide an introductory statement of about 10 to 15 minutes. We will then have a discussion. I will ask a few questions, and then I'll gladly take questions from the floor. So the first speaker we will have, Mark Fitzpatrick, he's the Director of Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program at the IISS in London. Mark has had a career just over a quarter century in the U.S. Department of State. The last posting, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation, and he oversaw the implementation of the PSI program in the U.S. government. Then we will have Seongwhun, who is a senior research fellow on my far left at the Korea Institute for National Reunification. Dr. Cheon is a member of the Foreign Affairs and Security Bureau of the Presidential Council for Future and Vision, and he is a member of the policy advisory committees for the Ministry of Unification and for crisis management in the Office of the President of the ROK. Then we have Dr. Han Hua, who is Associate Professor and a Director of Arms Control and Disarmament at the School of International Studies at Peking University in Beijing. And then finally, we have my colleague at the Carnegie Endowment, Adnan Vatansever, who is a Senior Associate in the Energy and Climate Program, who is a specialist in the energy sectors of Eurasia and with a focus on Russia, the Caspian region, and Iran. So we have people here from various areas of expertise on the Iranian front. This afternoon in the session just before, Chris Hill made an intervention where he said that we're in a situation at this meeting today in dealing with North Korean issues where major international problems can be shunned aside at a meeting like this because we have short-term developments that are intervening. And I think it would be fair to say for this panel on Iran that is not the case at all. We have a crisis which has been in development without any interruption, essentially, since the 1980s. And we now have a moment where the crisis has reached the point where we do have a short-term development of great significance that is going to be besetting us for the next several weeks. And that will be the focus of our discussion today. I said that Iran has been in a crisis since the 1980s. It is true that the nuclear issue has come to the fore really only since 2003, when the International Atomic Energy Agency cited Iran for non-compliance, essentially with its nuclear obligations, going back for a period of 18 years, where Iran essentially systematically deceived the international community about the nature and scope of its nuclear program. Why are we there where we are right now? As I said, the nuclear program in Iran has been basically on autopilot with very little interruption since the early 1980s. We've now reached the point in the development of Iran's nuclear capabilities that they have a growing and significant inventory of low-enriched uranium. We're heading toward an inventory of somewhere near 6,000 kilograms of 3% enriched uranium. In addition, in the last several years, we've added the problem of the production of uranium enriched to 20%. We're heading toward a situation where the inventory in Iran of 20% enriched uranium will be nearing 1,000 kilograms very soon. There has been a legacy of weaponization development in this country going back to the late 1980s. At the same time, while the enrichment program in Iran is getting most of the attention, Iran has continued developing capabilities in the area of processing and plutonium. These are out of the attention span of most of us, but they continue to develop. And last and not least, Iran, in the last generation and a half, has developed a growing cadre of nuclear technicians, engineers, and physicists who are deeply embedded in this program. So with that as the curtain raiser, it's inevitable right now that we're talking about a crisis which is coming to a point of no return. It's inevitable that we're talking about red lines. Back in 2003, even before the IAEA had confirmed that Iran had a centrifuge enrichment plant at Natanz, I recall I went to a Scandinavian country for a visit because a friend of mine, a college friend of mine, had been appointed ambassador there. He arranged a dinner party in my honor when I went to his embassy. And at this time, this is just about the time when the Natanz issue was coming to the fore internally, I recall having a conversation with a very senior Israeli diplomat who was present at that dinner. And we asked him how Israel would respond to this development, and he said very unabashedly, this is 2003, he said, if they enriched uranium at that facility, we're going to take it out. And that was what he had to say. That was an off-the-cuff, if you will, impromptu, unofficial statement made by someone who was very senior, who basically reacted in that manner. What we've seen, of course, is a situation where that so-called red line has come and gone. Other red lines have been named. As I said, the Iranian nuclear development appears to be essentially on autopilot. So here we are right now. We've got growing capabilities in this area, and it was essentially inevitable that the one state in the region that feels most threatened by this development, Israel, has entered, as I would put it, as the elephant in the room in these negotiations, which will be continuing soon. So right now, what we're seeing is a kind of a rush to engage Iran. Engaging Iran is on the lips of many, many people in all walks of life, but it came up during a meeting that Mark Fitzpatrick and his organization led in Brussels in February at the IISS on nonproliferation in Europe. One of the guests was Prince Turki, who is known to many of you, who raised this issue of what it meant to engage Iran. And Prince Turki said this very important point. He said, if we talk about engaging Iran, we have to make a distinction between engaging with the aim of crisis management, which is where we've been since 2003, essentially, and engagement with the goal of reaching a comprehensive solution to this crisis. And those are two very different things, and maybe we can get into that a little bit in this discussion. So, to bring it forward, we've had a meeting in Istanbul. We're going to have another meeting in Baghdad. In the meantime, sanctions are on the table. They've been with us since 2006, but the next round is imminent. I and my colleagues at Carnegie published an op-ed piece in the New York Times the day before the Istanbul talks began, basically putting down the baseline that these talks with Iran basically have 6 weeks to succeed, 11 weeks. 11 weeks to succeed because, again, the Israeli factors there, other things are coming to bear. There's domestic politics playing out in several other countries. So with that being the backdrop for this discussion, I would invite Mark Fitzpatrick to start.
Thank you, Mark. I hope that 11 weeks will not be the boundary line for talks. I should start off by thanking the Asan Institute for inviting me to speak at this occasion and to address the question of Iran during a unusually positive period. Pessimism, optimism fluctuates with regard to Iran, and we're in a rare period of optimism. Now, I wonder if this optimism will last 11 weeks. Will it last the 16 days that the U.S.-North Korea Leap Day deal lasted? Yeah, maybe it'll last for a while, but I think the pendulum probably will swing back to pessimism before November. I say that because the fundamental differences between the two sides really are not in sight to be overcome. The fundamental difference that has blocked any solution to the Iranian nuclear crisis for the past 10 years is that Iran wants to have a breakout capability. They want to be able to produce nuclear weapons as soon as possible once a decision is made. And Iran's counterparts, in this case, the 6 nations that are its negotiating partners, and the Security Council as a whole, don't want it to have that capability. And how one can find a solution given these two fundamentally differing strategic objectives, well, it's a real challenge for diplomacy. Now, in the talks that ensued in Istanbul, they came off relatively positively because neither side had to make any concessions. They agreed that the issue would be dealt with from the perspective of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And Iran saw that as code for saying that their right to enrichment would be recognized. That's not a bad thing. It wasn't explicit, and I think anybody who looks at this realizes that that will have to be part of the solution. But it's exactly saying so will be only later on in the discussion. So you start off by saying we talk about this issue as part of the NPT. Maybe there will be a confidence building measure agreed to. There's been talk that the initial objective is that Iran would stop producing 20% enriched uranium in exchange for receipt of fuel enriched to that level for its Tehran research reactor, something that President Ahmadinejad had suggested last fall, so he's being taken at his word. But that's not enough, really, to meet the initial requirements of the United States. The United States and its allies have said have to stop 20% enrichment, have to ship out of the country the stockpile of 20% enrichment, and have to stop, at least suspend operations at the Fordo enrichment facility. And I don't see any possibility in this initial round that Iran is going to accept condition 3, and probably not condition 2 either. At most, I think they might suspend 20% enrichment, but to ship out of the country the stockpile or to suspend operations at Fordo, they will need something in return, something very significant in return. And I don't think there's anything that the United States during an election year can give them, or that France can give them. Now, maybe France's attitude will change a bit if François Hollande comes to power, but will the European Union decide to postpone the cutoff of oil sales? Will the United States decide to postpone the imposition of sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran, both of which are supposed to come into play on July 1st or thereabouts? I really doubt it. And then in this case, Iran is not going to make the concessions that will be necessary to persuade the other power that Mark Hibbs mentioned, Israel. Israel's position is that Iran is going to be entering a period of a zone of immunity when operations at Fordo put Iran's enrichment program out of reach of Israeli conventional military attack. Fordo is about 80 meters under rock. It's not impenetrable to U.S. heavy ordnance, but probably is to Israeli. And so if you're Israel and you see this program continuing and posing what is regarded as a threat to your very nation, I think that the talk in Israel about taking action will resume before November, during the period when Israel also sees a period of a window of opportunity before the U.S. election, when no U.S. presidential candidate can be seen to be opposing Israel. So I'm sorry that I started off a little bit optimistically and ending up pessimistically, that I think we are likely to have a crisis on our hand before the beginning of November, unless somehow one confidence-building measure can lead to another. But the confidence building, it's got to be a two-sided confidence building. And what Iran wants is, I think, going to be hard for the other side to present. Now, maybe sanctions, as they continue to bite, will give Iran more of an incentive to take steps. But if you read the Iranian press, they're casting this talk in Istanbul as having been the result of a U.S. realization that Obama needs a political victory during an election year, and a realization that the rest of the world agrees that Iran's enrichment is a legitimate right. They don't talk about this being the result of sanctions at all. You can't talk about it that way in Iran. Surely they realize it, but Iran will not bow to perceived pressure. At most, they have to get something out of this deal, and I don't know if they're going to find enough to get out of it. I'll stop there because we don't have much time, and I want to hear the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm also glad our technical people here have solved our little problem. Seems that now I can speak without causing a short circuit in the electrical system in the building. So now I'll turn to Dr. Cheon, who will talk about Iran somewhat in the context of Korea and this region.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I'm very glad to be here through invitation of the Asan Institute, and I express my thanks to Asan Institute. And I'd like to spend my time on explaining Iran's nuclear issue from South Korea's security perspective, especially in relation to North Korea's nuclear programs. Since there is no security ties between South Korea and the countries in the Middle East, there are very few knowledge in Korean society of what's going on in the Middle East, especially Iran's nuclear program. So there are naturally, I think there are many questions that could be raised from South Korean public. So on behalf of Korean people, I also like to present some of the questions, some of the questions to the panelists, and I would be very happy to hear from their answers from the foreign panelists here. Actually, too many South Koreans, today's Iran nuclear problem confronted by the international communities, something like a mirror image of North Korean nuclear crisis that we have observed past 20 years. And currently, as you see, Iran is arguing that they are working on this nuclear program solely for peaceful purposes, which is guaranteed under the NPT Article 4. And at the same time, they are hiding some undetected nuclear facilities. And once these facilities are revealed, then they try to minimize verification activities as much as they can. And this pattern of behavior is worrisome to South Korean people because it is the exact path, we think, followed by North Korea for the past 20 years. It's sort of deja vu. And if you look past how this North Korean nuclear crisis has developed, from the beginning, North Korean authorities, including the founding father Kim Il-sung, they've said that they're using this nuclear energy solely for peaceful purposes. They have neither intention nor capability to develop nuclear weapons. That was their policy until 2005, when the Foreign Ministry proclaimed that they have made these nuclear weapons, and they further build up their nuclear deterrence, and they used the pretext of American and South Korean nuclear threat as a justification to their nuclear weapon development. So while at the beginning, in the front, they are saying that they are using nuclear energy for the peaceful purposes, while at the same time, at the backyard, what they did is to develop nuclear weapons programs. And of course, throughout this period, we have tried many types of negotiations from beginning with this bilateral inter-Korean nuclear talks, through U.S. DPRK nuclear talks, and then 4-party talks, and then finally 6-party talks. And whenever we have these negotiations, we get some optimism, and then as Lip-Day showed, these agreements are broken, then we face pessimism, another fluctuation, a series of these fluctuations of optimism and pessimism, like a sine-cosine curve in the mathematics. And Iran's nuclear program is troublesome to Korea because that could directly affect South Korea's security as well. I think it is well known that Iran and North Korea, they have kept a strong military relationship for the past 20 years from virtually every area of military, from conventional military cooperation to missile cooperation to nuclear technology cooperations as well. And in the wake of Israeli bombing of a secret the reactor that was built by North Koreans in Syria in September 2007, there is another suspicion emerged that there might be a triangular relationship between Syria, Iran, and North Korea regarding nuclear weapon development programs. And from South Korea's national security perspectives, there are several questions that should be reserved. I think in collaboration with the international community, as well as like-minded countries. Let me raise several questions. Number one is, what is the ultimate red line of Iran's nuclear weapon program? Crossing of which will justify military strike. And when will it be? And as Mark said, maybe the timing would be this fall, before the American presidential election. And second, the question is that recently Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei said this February that Iran is not seeking a nuclear weapon, which is a sin, religious sin. And I think his remarks seem to boost a new hope for a round of negotiation, and while delaying using this military strike option, as what Mark Hibbs and Mark Fitzpatrick elaborated very detailed. But how likely is this new round of negotiation would be successful, based on what we have experienced last decade? And another question is that if Iran peacefully gives up its nuclear weapons program, or if Iran's nuclear program is destroyed by military strike, does that mean that we can sure that Iran is just nuclearly incapable? All these programs and capabilities are wiped out. Can we sure? My concern is that Iran may still collaborate with North Korea and ask North Korea to do the businesses instead of Tehran. Less than 2 years ago, everybody knows that North Korea bluntly revealed a ultra-modern uranium enrichment plant in Yongbyon. Until that time, they have denied any existence of either programs or people or technology regarding enrichment program in North Korea. There was a big shock to the international community. And finally, it is very well known that UN Security Council resolutions now activating against North Korea, 1695, 1718, and 1874, it has many loopholes, I mean, in terms of implementing, and actually undermining this effective implementation of the resolutions. And I'm sorry that we have Chinese colleagues here, but frequently China is quoted as the main source of this loopholes. And my question is, how about Iran? Iran must be another source of this loophole regarding North Korea, and maybe vice versa. North Korea may be a loophole regarding Iran. Okay? And according to the last year's report, the undisclosed report by UN Security Council's Sanctioning Committee regarding North Korea, prohibited items, including missile items and technologies, are suspected to be transferred between North Korea and Iran through the chartered flights between Air Koryo and Iranian Air, through a third country, presumably China. Okay? So I think it is very important from a South Korean national security perspective to disconnect this another, presumably a triangular relationship between Iran, North Korea, and a neighboring third country. And my question is what we can and should to disconnect this triangular relationship. And let me stop here.
Thank you very much. The third panelist to address us will be Dr. Han from China. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to start my talk by saying that Chinese tend to be more pessimistic than optimistic than pessimistic in this solution of an Iranian nuclear issue. I have three reasons to say that. The first one is that we just get some good sign from the beginning of this year when U.S. sent a letter to Iran, and Iran sent back a letter to the U.S. talking about the possible resume of this nuclear issue talk, under the framework of P5+1. So that's a good beginning. And after one talk in Turkey just a week ago, even no breakthrough or some very substantial outcomes from this talk, but we can say the both sides, they talk quite positively about the momentum about this diplomatic solution of this nuclear issue. And secondly, I think from what the U.S. has done under the Obama administration, even amid of some war threat from Israel, the U.S. still insists that maybe we cannot rule out all possible solutions, or including military actions, but still wants to emphasize diplomatic talk. And Iran too. I think after 1 year break of the diplomatic dialogue, Iran has shown his willingness to get back to the negotiation table. So Iran, in this talk, I think Iran showed his quite positive way. Even they think, Iranian, they claim, if you don't want to recognize our nuclear capability, we cannot make any compromise. But we still think maybe in the next few weeks in Iraq, right? The next dialogue, I think maybe they're going to have a more substantial outcomes. Second reason why I'm more optimistic is that for many Chinese, they still think Iran has not really decided what they want to do. Even they say, oh, we are a nuclear state, but how far they will go and if they want to be a nuclear state, it's not really clearly demonstrated. Of course, I know Iranian they want to show the world that they don't want to cross the threshold as a nuclear weapon state, but I still think from the history of the nuclear program, the evolution of this nuclear program, I can say the leaders are not very, they don't have a consensus how far they will go. But some Chinese, they claim that they believe, or maybe they assume, Iran want to be getting everything ready, but are not going to cross the threshold, just like what India did in before 1998. Or some people claim that Iran is doing something like Japan in recent decades. So that's second reason. The third reason is that many Chinese, they still think the nuclear capability in Iran is not that developed as many reports claim. Even the Iranian leaders, president claimed that they can they can advance maybe 20% of the uranium enrichment. But I still think sometimes maybe the leaders want to see more than what they have, so they can have some kind of high leverage in the dialogue or negotiation. Even CIA or other intelligence reports, and including the latest IAEA report, so far we haven't really had hard evidence saying that Iran can have very advanced enrichment capability. But the problem is what China would like to say. I think, first of all, I should say for the Chinese, the government especially, it clears that China does not want to say a nuclear weaponized Iran. That is maybe the main principle of the Chinese policy. But at the same time, China insists that the nuclear issues, Iran has the legitimate rights to engage in the enrichment. But the problem is facing for the Chinese is that how about higher enriched uranium higher than 20%? That's a tipping point to show what we should to do. And also, I think another tipping point is that if Iran shows some kind of activities, has engaged some activities showing that that country wants to really develop some nuclear design or nuclear bomb, this kind of technology, maybe they will put China in a harder choice to say if they should do something more intensified diplomatic measures. But overall, China does not want to see a war in Middle East. Even it's what I should say. It's a tough choice. But still, a war in Middle East is I think is the most worst scenario China would like to say. I will stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Han. And the last speaker is my colleague at Carnegie, Dr. Vatansever. Please.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you very much for the invitation here. I'm very pleased to be speaking here. Now, what I'm going to talk about is one particular aspect which is very closely related to the nuclear negotiations with Iran. And this is about the effectiveness of the oil sanctions. As most of you know, the sanctions were launched at the end of last year by U.S. President Obama and also followed up by the European Union. And in terms of European Union, they will be in effect as of 1st of July, basically. The general idea is that Iran depends heavily on oil revenues, oil export revenues. More than half of its budget revenues come from oil, and export revenues predominantly come from oil. So the hope is that if these oil revenues are cut substantially, this could possibly lead to a breakthrough in the negotiations, in the nuclear negotiations with Iran. Now, there are quite a few others that go further by saying that this is pretty much the only non-military means to deal with Iran that is left before something much worse, like war, happens. So the effectiveness of these oil sanctions is quite substantial. What I'd like to do is talk about four issues, four topics here quickly. The first is what are these sanctions about? Just a quick overview. The second is, are they working? The third, what are the main challenges? And finally, how could they be made really effective? Now, regarding what are these sanctions about? The idea behind the sanctions is that Iran is currently exporting about 2.2 million barrels a day, and the numbers could vary depending on what source you're looking at. But the idea is to lead to a drastic reduction in the amount of export so that Iran actually gets much less revenue. And if sanctions are imposed, the countries that are currently importing oil from Iran are expected to substantially reduce or even cut totally their imports. 18% of the oil last year was going to Europe, and most of the rest was going to the countries in Asia. It's China, India, Japan, and Korea being the four largest buyers in Asia. So this is basically the idea that the amount that goes to as revenues to Iran should go down. Now, are the sanctions working? Of course, the question here is what is the purpose? How do we define success here? If we define success as a breakthrough in the negotiations, of course, it's too early to say anything about that. But if we look at the intermediate goal, where all sanctions serve as a means to the end, again, it is early to say whether they are working. And the reason is that the sanctions have two goals. One is to drastically cut oil revenues to Iran, and the second thing is to maintain stability in the global oil markets. Because in theory, you can cut to oil imports from Iran, but if it leads to extremely high oil prices in the world, that could undermine the global economic recovery. So that is not something that is desired here. If you look at these two aspects, one can say that the oil prices have already spiked. They are about 20% higher than when this momentum for the sanctions started in October. And on the other hand, revenues to Iran, it is again too early to say that they have gone down, simply because Iran, even if Iran has been selling part of its oil at a discount, simply because the prices of oil went so much higher, they are not really losing too much revenue. And according to various reports, the amount of oil that is exported by Iran has not really gone down substantially or any significantly. And Iran would actually claim that it has gone up, and it's hard to believe these numbers. But generally, they have not really gone down substantially, at least at this point. So it's early to say whether they are working successfully, but the big question here is that whether they can actually work successfully in the next year or so, because this is the big question, and this is the period that we are talking about, the critical period about the future of these nuclear negotiations. So here I'd like to go to the next question, which is about the challenges that these sanctions will face, and just quick overview about how oil markets work, and two major challenges related to the nature of the oil markets. The first is the gravity of the oil markets has been shifting in the past years. And they have been shifting towards Asia, away from the OECD countries in Europe and North America. This has substantial implications. I mean, countries that are imposing or have launched the sanctions, US does not import any oil from Iran, and European Union actually imported 18%. So they are not really the main buyers of Iranian oil. The main buyers are in Asia, and they actually have quite substantially different priorities here. For them, energy security is a much bigger priority, and especially for countries where oil demand is growing very rapidly, like India and China. Meeting that demand is quite big priority, and their considerations are very much impacted by this kind of priority when they are thinking about imposing or adhering to these sanctions. Now, the second thing is about the nature of the oil trading business. Oil trading has been very non-transparent for ages, and it's not getting better. And actually, one can even say that it is probably going into the other direction. Partly because there are like too many players which allow too many opportunities for Iran to sell its oil by disguising the origin of oil. Just one quick number here. Iran's maritime carrier, the national maritime carrier, it has a huge fleet. It's not about oil, but the fleet itself. Its fleet changed its flag name or ownership over 900 times in the past 4 years only. And the same tactics will be applied to oil, obviously, which will disguise the origin. But the other thing is that in the past, you had most of the shipping companies and also trading companies were basically based in the West. Now you have another change. The leading companies are actually in the top 10 physical traders. You have 3 companies from China, and again from tanker charterers. Among the biggest players, you have companies from India and China. And what happens is that Iran approaches to them with a possible good deal, such as a discount for the oil and a premium for shipping. And of course, it becomes very enticing to be part of this game with Iran, which makes effective sanctions a little bit difficult. But this does not mean that sanctions cannot be effective. So there are a few things that can be done about that. One is to have much more clear time frame about that. Currently, the time frame is not defined, and if you look at the Energy Information Administration's report that was released almost 2 months ago, it's noticed that the current spare capacity in the oil market is about 2.5 million barrels a day. Compare it to 2.2 million barrels a day of Iranian exports. If you use all of the spare capacity, the oil market should work completely perfectly. Otherwise, even the slightest thing would lead to a major oil price hike. Now, what needs to be done is defining a better time frame there. And again, in the same report, Energy Information Administration report, you do see that by the end of next year, the spare capacity is expected to grow to 3.7 million barrels a day. That means quite a different picture, much better terms for dealing with this. Of course, the question is that clock is ticking about Iran. What can be done? This is a very valid question, but at the same time, if the oil sanctions are rushed, if they become ineffective, they also lose their credibility, and things may get worse. So with better time frame, this could be managed. The other thing is the ceiling about Iran is not defined yet, and that probably also needs to be defined in order to give a very clear message about Iran. If Iran really decides to defy the international community and develop its capacity to build a nuclear bomb, it should be pretty clear how much oil it can export to the world. If this message is given, that could also help. Now, the third thing is the US and the European Union really need to bring together a larger coalition on the subject, such as countries in Asia and also the producers in the Gulf. Mm-hmm. And there are certain suspicions whether this could be done in the short run, but But generally, it should be possible to claim that most countries, buyers of the oil and also suppliers, will have interest in stability in the markets. If Iran becomes a country with a nuclear power, it becomes actually a major source of instability for the oil markets in the future. OPEC countries would really have hard time sitting on an OPEC meeting with a nuclear Iran, and it's very hard to predict what would that lead for the oil markets. And the final thing is the sanctions are currently to a large extent focused on financial measures, and given the loopholes that are existing in the world market of trading oil and also shipping oil, trading and shipping probably would also need to be targeted, or also they have to be part of the sanctions in order to make them effective. Now, just to conclude, there is a lot of skepticism whether sanctions would be effective, and there are countries that are actually argued that they will never be effective, such as Russia, for instance, has been opposing, claiming that they cannot be effective. And one of the most common examples is that they were not really too effective in case of Iraq. I would be more optimistic because compared to Iraq, Iran is still, I would say, not exactly a perfect democracy, but it has elections that to some extent they matter, and that is quite significant. And the last thing that I would say is that the whole thing about Iran crisis and all sanctions point out to one bigger problem that is there, and this is the oil addiction. I mean, U.S. consumers are affected by Iran's behavior or the current crisis every day by paying more for their gasoline, even though U.S. is not importing any gasoline or any oil from Iran. And many countries that would really like to reduce their shipments from Iran can't do so because of the oil addiction. And the solution for that is only in the longer run. Thank you.
Thank you, Adnan. That concludes the presentation part of the session. We have about 10 minutes left before we have to conclude the discussion. I will ask one question, and then I will open the discussion to others. And I ask you, if you want to ask a question, please do so. Tell us who you are and wait for the microphone to arrive, and then ask your question, and please be brief. I have one question for Dr. Han. It's come up through the discussion that's percolated already in the other panels this morning about the unique relationship that Russia and, to a greater extent, China has with powers that are engaged in thorny negotiations with Western states. In looking at the negotiation that we're involved in now, some of the concern that has been expressed by the expert community is that Iran will have an opportunity to pick and choose and seek to find a weakness, to find a lowest common denominator among all of the P5+1 countries that it's facing. And for that reason, the negotiators are highly focused on the necessity to keep Russia and China on the same page. What we hear is that so far they have, but we haven't really gotten into the details of negotiation. And my question for you, Dr. Han, is what has to happen such that China and Russia are together with the West in this negotiation?
Excuse me, your question about China and Russia, how?
What has to happen in this negotiation? What would keep China and Russia on the same page as the other powers and facing an Iran in this negotiation?
Okay. Should I answer that question? I think the most important reason behind the two countries getting together is that after the Western countries, especially the U.S., withdraws from doing business with Iran or regimes that it does not like. I think Russia and China have involved in the Middle East, especially from the economic or energy perspectives. So I think if you talk about P5, you can say maybe the strongest linkage, I mean, the relationship with Iran actually is Russia, not China. But China, I mean, everybody knows the energy security problem drove China in that area. But I still think China has a very limited purpose, especially from the strategic purpose in Middle East. But when we talk about sanctions, so we found the strongest, common interest to against or maybe to resist strong or intensified sanctions. So maybe because the economic or some energy interest behind these two countries, but also I think only these two countries have working relations with Iran.
I'm going to take one question, and then or two. I'll take two, and then we're going to have to close off. So please.
Yes, my name is Jorge Jaime. I'm with the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada. I have a question for Mr. Fitzgerald. It's a sort of fundamental question in the following sense. One can understand that there are a number of reasons why many countries around the world would not want Iran to acquire a nuclear capability. The one that is most frequently adduced, though, if we look back at deterrence theory, to my mind has very little credibility. That is a possible nuclear attack of Iran on Israel. The notion that an established government in full control of its territory that is not known for its suicidal tendencies would attack Iran with nuclear weapons, knowing full well what exactly would happen a few minutes or hours after that, which might be the total annihilation of many cities and much of the country, strains credibility. I don't believe that would happen. Yet, it's an argument that is put on the table over and over again. So I wonder what your views are on that.
I share the skepticism, the deep skepticism that Iran would purposely launch a nuclear attack on any country because of the suicide that would result. But I cannot say that there would be no possibility of somebody in Iran giving a nuclear weapon or selling a nuclear weapon to a group that would be willing to employ it. Not every country has been able to keep all of its nuclear assets as national assets. Look at the case of Pakistan, for example. I can't ignore the possibility that an Iran in possession of nuclear weapons would prompt other countries to acquire them. And the more countries that acquire them, the greater the likelihood of nuclear weapons being used by mistake or miscalculation exponentially increases. One can't ignore also the possibility that in a escalation of tension that a nuclear weapon might be employed, maybe not launched, but employed in other ways that Israel would feel it was a direct threat. So when I said that Israel felt that an Iran nuclear weapon was an existential threat, I don't think that it necessarily implies that there would be a purposeful attack. There are various other ways that a country can feel threatened. I'm not myself defending Israel's perspective here, but analyzing it, I can surely understand why a country that has gone through the history they've gone through would not feel as optimistic as you and I do sitting here in Seoul. If we were sitting in Tel Aviv, we might have a different perspective.
Right. One question, and that's it.
Thanks for the second chance.
Oh, I'm being told we've got to cut it off. I don't know why, but I'm sorry. The organizers have told me to end the discussion.
It's run out of time.
And thanks for the moderator to trying to give me the chance.
So, we are late. It was a truncated session. We ran overtime some sessions this morning, earlier this afternoon. But I want to thank you all for bearing with us and having the patience and staying here to the end. And I want to thank very much our panelists and the Asan Institute for hosting this session this afternoon. Thank you.
This concludes the session.